I set the audit on the conference table and said, "Turn to page 12." The room was completely still. My sister Renata's hand moved to her pearl necklace and stayed there. My father looked at the cover page and then looked away. My mother pressed her lips together into a line so thin it nearly disappeared. Our family attorney, a man named Gerald Fossey who had worked with my father for 22 years, stopped clicking his pen mid-click and set it down beside his notepad. I had been waiting 14 months for this moment, 14 months of keeping my voice calm at Sunday dinners, 14 months of absorbing my sister's explanations for missing revenue, her sighs about economic headwinds, her barely concealed contempt every time I asked to review the financials, 14 months of being told by my own parents that I was too aggressive, too suspicious, too difficult, that I needed to trust family. I had trusted family. That was exactly how $567,000 disappeared. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Drop your city in the comments because I always want to know where you are watching from, and today especially, I want to know I am not alone in this room. What you just witnessed, me sliding that audit across the table, is the moment my entire adult life had been building toward. Not the moment I stopped being a victim, because I want to be very clear, I was never just a victim. I was a strategist who had not yet found the right stage, but this was the stage, and I had been building it brick by brick for over a year. To understand why that moment mattered, I have to take you back, not to my childhood, not to some formative wound, just to the company, how it was built, and what my sister did to it while everyone in my family watched and called it my fault. My name is Adriana Voss. I am 38 years old. I am the older daughter of Martin and Cecilia Voss, who in 1992 founded a commercial interior design and procurement firm called Voss Contract Group out of a two-room office in Charlotte, North Carolina. By the time I joined the company full-time at 26, it had grown into a regional firm with 11 employees, contracts across the Southeast, and an annual revenue that had crossed $2 million for the first time the year before I arrived. My father had built something real. I understood that from the day I walked through the door, and I treated it accordingly. My sister Renata is 3 years younger than me. She's also smarter than most people give her credit for. I want to say that clearly because what happened was not about intelligence. Renata is charming in a way I never learned to be. She has our mother's warmth and our father's easy confidence, and when she walks into a room, people lean toward her without knowing why. She was always the one who made our parents laugh at dinner, who remembered every family friend's birthday, who cried at the right moments and smiled at the right ones. I was the one who got things done. I joined Voss Contract Group in 2011 after 6 years at a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta where I had learned procurement, project management, and the kind of vendor relationship work that is genuinely unglamorous but makes a business function. I was good at it. I came back to Charlotte because my father asked me to, because he was starting to talk about legacy and succession, and because I genuinely loved what he had built and wanted to be part of what it became. Renata joined 2 years after me in 2013. She came in as Director of Client Relations, a title that suited her perfectly because Renata could sit across from a developer with a $90 million project and make him feel like she had been thinking about nothing but his lobby for the past 3 weeks. She was genuinely good at bringing in business. I want to be fair about that because the story I am about to tell you does not require me to pretend Renata was incompetent. She was not. She was talented and she was deliberately corrupt, and those two things coexisted without any difficulty. My official title was Director of Operations. In practice, I ran the business. I managed the vendor contracts, the project timelines, the staff, the financials, and the client delivery. My father stayed involved in strategy and big-picture decisions. My mother served on the board nominally. She had always been the one who kept the relationships warm, the holiday cards sent, the thank you notes handwritten, but she deferred to my father on anything financial. Renata handled client acquisition and external relationships. I handled everything that happened after the contract was signed. This arrangement worked more or less for the first 3 years. The company grew, we hired more staff, we moved into a better office on South Tryon Street. Our father would sit at the head of the conference table at quarterly reviews and look around at his 2 daughters running the company he had built, and you could see something in his face that I can only describe as peace. That mattered to me. It still matters to me, even now, even knowing what I know. The first sign that something was wrong, the first sign I recognized as a sign anyway, came in the fourth quarter of 2016. I was reviewing our vendor payment records in preparation for year-end, and I noticed that a disbursement of $42,000 had gone out to a procurement subcontractor called Meridian Fulfillment Solutions that I did not recognize. We had a relatively stable vendor list. I knew our suppliers. I had negotiated most of those contracts personally. Meridian Fulfillment Solutions was not a name I had ever encountered. I pulled the invoice. It listed services rendered for, quote, strategic procurement consultation and materials sourcing for the Harwell Office Park Phase 2 project. The Harwell project was real. It was a 7-month renovation of a corporate campus in Ballantyne, one of our bigger projects that year. But the services described on the Meridian invoice did not correspond to anything I had authorized or received. The deliverables were vague, the timeline did not match our project's schedule, and the payment had been approved without my signature using a secondary authorization code that technically existed in our system for emergency vendor payments when I was unreachable, a code that Renata had access to. I did not say anything immediately. That is important to understand. I did not go to my father, I did not confront Renata, I did not send a company-wide email. I opened a new folder on my personal hard drive, copied the invoice, flagged the transaction in my own notes, and went back to work. I was not certain of anything yet. There was a version of events in which Meridian was legitimate, in which Renata had brought in a subcontractor I simply had not been introduced to, in which there was an explanation that would embarrass me for having been suspicious. I needed more information before I was willing to be embarrassed. That quarter, I attended my cousin's wedding in Asheville and sat at a table with my Aunt Rosa, who had worked in forensic accounting for 17 years before retiring. We were on our second glass of wine, and she was telling me about a case she had worked involving a small manufacturing company, and she said something I have thought about many times since. She said the signature of internal theft is almost never a single anomaly. It is a pattern of small normalizations. Each individual transaction is just barely within the range of what might be legitimate. The theft is not in the transaction, it is in the accumulation. I drove back to Charlotte the next morning thinking about normalizations. If you have ever had a suspicion that you could not yet prove, and you have had to smile across a dinner table at the person you suspected while your mind ran the numbers quietly behind your eyes, then you know exactly what the next several months felt like. You smile. You pass the bread, you ask about their weekend, and you remember everything. By spring of 2017, I had found 3 more Meridian transactions, one for $28,000, one for $31,000, one for $17,500, each one tied to a real project we were running, each one with vague service descriptions that could technically be justified, each one approved through the emergency authorization code. $118,500 in total, and not $1 of it corresponding to any work product I had ever received or any vendor meeting I had ever attended. I began to research Meridian Fulfillment Solutions. The company was registered in Delaware, which told me nothing because half the shell companies in America are registered in Delaware. The registered agent was a legal services firm that processed incorporations for a flat fee. There was no website. There was no office address beyond a registered agent's P.O. box. There were no reviews, no industry listings, no trace of actual business operations of any kind. I am not going to tell you what I felt when I confirmed that. I'm going to tell you that I drove to the office the next morning, sat across from my sister while she talked about a prospective client in Raleigh, and I poured her coffee from the carafe on the conference table and I smiled. And I said that sounded like a great opportunity, and she said yes, she thought so too, and I drove home that evening and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I could go inside. The following week, I called an attorney. Her name was Priya Sundaram, and she was a partner at a firm that specialized in business litigation and forensic financial disputes. A colleague from my Atlanta days had worked with her on a partnership dissolution and said she was the kind of lawyer you wanted standing next to you when things got serious. I had held onto her card for 2 years, tucked in the back of my desk drawer, not entirely sure why I had never thrown it out. I brought Priya the Meridian documents and a summary of what I had found. She looked at everything for a long time, then she looked at me. Her voice was quiet and deliberate. "Is there any reason you haven't brought this to your father?" I told her I was not ready. I told her I did not know yet how deep it went, and I did not want to blow up my family's company on the basis of 4 transactions when there might be 20 more I hadn't found yet. She nodded slowly. "Then we need to get you in front of a forensic accountant before you do anything else. If this is what it looks like, you're going to need documentation that can withstand a challenge. Not just your own records, an independent audit with a clean chain of custody." I asked her how long that would take. "That depends on how much access you have," she said. I told her I was the director of operations and that I had full access to every financial system the company owned. She looked at me for a moment and then said quietly, "Then we can move quickly." That was the beginning of what I came to think of as the parallel life. On one side of the wall, Adriana Voss, company executive, dutiful daughter, Sunday dinner attendee, person who asked Renata how her week was going. On the other side, the same woman, pulling transaction records at 11 o'clock at night, forwarding documents to Priya's secure server, building a picture that I both desperately wanted to finish and desperately hoped would turn out to be wrong. It was not wrong. By August of 2017, the forensic accountant Priya had engaged a man named Douglas Cha who had 23 years of experience and the affect of someone who has seen every possible way that people steal from each other and is no longer surprised by any of them, had identified 11 separate transactions to Meridian Fulfillment Solutions totaling $244,000 over 18 months. He had also identified a second entity, a company called Vantage Source Partners, registered in Nevada, with an address that turned out to be a UPS store in Henderson. Vantage Source had received 4 payments from Voss Contract Group totaling $91,000, all approved through the same emergency authorization code, all for services that Douglas described in his notes as, quote, non-verifiable with no corresponding documentation, $335,000. In 18 months, through 2 shell companies, through an authorization code that only one other person in the company had access to, and that was just the beginning. I remember sitting in Douglas's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late August while he walked me through the transaction map he had built. It was a visual document, boxes and arrows and color coding, and it showed the flow of money from our operating accounts out to Meridian and Vantage Source, and then into a third account that Douglas had traced through banking records. He could not tell me whose account it was, not yet, not without a subpoena. But he could tell me the routing information, and he had a strong professional opinion about the likely ownership structure. I looked at the chart for a long time, then I asked him how much more he thought there was. He set his pen down on the desk very deliberately. I think what you've seen so far is the middle of the story, he said, not the beginning. I had been managing operations at Voss Contract Group for 6 years. I had reviewed every major contract, negotiated every significant vendor relationship, approved every capital expenditure above $10,000, or so I had believed. What Douglas was beginning to show me was that there existed a parallel financial layer to our company, transactions I had never seen, approvals I had never given, vendors I had never met, that had been running beneath the surface of our legitimate business for longer than I had initially suspected. In the 2 months that followed, Douglas expanded his review, and I gave him everything he needed. Priya guided the process and kept me from doing anything that would compromise the integrity of the audit trail. I want to be honest about how hard those 2 months were, not because I want sympathy, but because I think it matters for you to understand that what I eventually did in that boardroom did not come from a place of cold detachment. Every page Douglas flagged was a page of something I had spent 6 years building. Every ghost transaction was a vote of contempt for the work I had done, the hours I had kept, the faith I had put in the idea that what we were doing together as a family was worth something. Renata drove a Range Rover, dark navy, the newer model. She had renovated her kitchen the prior spring. I had seen the photos, the marble counters, the custom cabinetry, the wine refrigerator built into the island. She had taken a trip to Portugal in the summer with her husband Theo, a sales executive at a medical device company, and posted photographs of the Alentejo region and a hotel that I had looked up out of morbid curiosity and found to be approximately $800 a night. None of these things were impossible on a legitimate salary. Theo made good money. Renata made good money. But nothing about her lifestyle had ever triggered an alarm because she had always been careful to keep it just within the range of plausible. That was the normalization my Aunt Rosa had warned me about. In October of 2017, my father called a quarterly review. He was 71 by then and had been stepping back gradually from day-to-day operations, which is to say he had been stepping back from oversight while trusting that his daughters were handling everything in good faith. He sat at the head of the table and asked for the revenue summary for the third quarter. Renata presented it. She was composed and thorough and cited 3 new client relationships she had developed and projected a strong fourth quarter. My father nodded and looked satisfied. I sat across the table and presented the operational summary, which showed slightly compressed margins on 2 major projects, which I attributed accurately for the record to material cost increases from one of our primary vendors. My father frowned mildly and asked what we were doing to address it. Before I could answer, Renata turned to him and said very gently that she thought part of the issue was that some of our vendor relationships needed to be renegotiated and that Adriana had always been resistant to bringing in new procurement partners who might offer better terms. I felt the air in the room change. My father looked at me. I said calmly that I was happy to review any specific vendor recommendations Renata had. Renata smiled. She said she would put together a list. She never put together a list because the vendor recommendations she was referring to were Meridian Fulfillment Solutions and Vantage Source Partners, and the last thing she wanted was to put those names in front of me in writing in a room where our father was watching. I understood that in that moment with absolute clarity. I understood that I was being positioned. That the narrative being constructed slowly, carefully, in small moments at quarterly reviews and Sunday dinners was one in which the company's financial performance issues were attributable to my management, and the solution being implied was a rebalancing of authority away from me and toward Renata. I drove home and called Priya from my car, sitting in the parking structure below our building. I told her what had happened. I told her I thought the timeline was accelerating, that Renata was beginning to lay groundwork to shift blame, and that I needed to know how close Douglas was to a final number. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll call Douglas tonight, but Adriana, how are you?" I told her I was fine. She said, "I know, I'm asking anyway." That was the moment of genuine human connection that I did not expect to find in the middle of all of this. Not sympathy for what had been stolen from me, not professional concern about a client's emotional state, just a woman who had heard a lot of terrible things from a lot of people and was asking whether I specifically was okay. I sat in that parking structure for another 5 minutes after we hung up, and I let myself feel what I had been not feeling for the better part of a year. Then I drove home. Douglas delivered his preliminary findings in November of 2017. The total at that point was $489,000 across 3 shell entities. He had found the third one, a company called Breyer Consulting LLC, registered in Wyoming, which had received $154,000 in a concentrated period between January and September of 2017. The pace had accelerated. Renata was moving faster, which Douglas noted in his report as a common indicator that an embezzler either believes they are about to be caught or has made a decision to exit. I sat with that report for a week before I showed it to anyone, not because I was uncertain, I was past uncertain, but because I needed to think clearly about what I was going to do with it and in what order. Here is what I knew. I could take Douglas's preliminary report to my father immediately and let the consequences unfold without further preparation. This option had the appeal of being fast and having the moral simplicity of doing the obvious thing. It also had the significant disadvantage of putting me in a position where I had no legal protection, no documented audit trail with formal chain of custody, no attorney present to manage the conversation, and no framework for what happened to the company and to me if Renata's response was to deny everything, produce counter-narratives, and turn my parents against me, which, based on the preceding year of careful positioning, is exactly what she would do, or I could wait. I could finish the audit. I could let Douglas complete his review and produce a report that would be admissible in any legal proceeding in the country. I could work with Priya to understand my legal options and my exposure and my protections. I could think about what I needed to have in place before I walked into a room with my family and said the thing that could not be unsaid. Waiting was not passivity. Waiting was architecture. I chose to wait. The thing about that choice is that it cost me something. Not money, the money was already gone, and Douglas recovering it was a matter of legal process, not personal strategy. What it cost me was the period between November of 2017 and the following January, during which the total reached $567,000 because I had not stopped it yet, during which my parents continued to sit at the head of the dinner table looking at both their daughters with the same warmth, during which Renata continued to smile at me across conference room tables, and I continued to smile back. There is a version of this story in which that makes me callous, in which a decent person would have said something the moment they knew. I have made my peace with the version of myself who chose to wait, because the version of myself who confronted Renata in November with a preliminary report and no legal framework would have watched everything she built dismantled by denial and family politics, and the $567,000 would have become a family dispute instead of a forensic fact. I needed it to be a fact. In December of 2017, something happened that accelerated my timeline. My father mentioned at a Sunday dinner that I remember very clearly because it was the week before Christmas, and my mother had made her lamb and Renata had brought a bottle of wine that I later calculated cost approximately $300, that he had been thinking about the succession structure of the company. He said he wanted both of his daughters to have equal ownership, which was the current structure, but he said he had been considering whether it made sense, given the different roles they each played, to formalize a different division of operational authority. He looked at Renata when he said it, not at me. I picked up my wine glass and took a drink, a real drink. I needed a moment. My mother said she thought that sounded sensible. She said she had been thinking the same thing, that the current structure put a lot of pressure on Adriana, and that perhaps it would be healthier for everyone if some of the operational oversight moved to Renata's side of the house. Renata said with perfect humility that she did not want to create any conflict and that whatever my father thought was best, she would support. My father said he appreciated that. He said he would have Gerald draw something up in the new year. Gerald Fossey, family attorney. The man with the pen who had been clicking it for 22 years. I said I thought that sounded like a good idea and that I would be happy to review whatever Gerald put together. I drove home and called Priya and told her we needed to move the timeline up. I needed a final audit report, and I needed a plan for the board meeting that my father held every January to review the prior year's performance and set direction for the coming year. I had exactly 3 weeks. Priya said she would call Douglas that night. What happened in those 3 weeks belongs to the preparation phase of this story, and I'm going to tell you about it in detail because I think the how matters as much as the what. But first, let me tell you what was happening in Renata's world during the same period, because some of it I knew in real time and some of it I pieced together afterward, and all of it matters. Renata and Theo had been married for 9 years. They had a son named Eli who was 7 and whom I genuinely loved, which made all of this complicated in ways I did not allow myself to dwell on while I was building the case. Theo was pleasant enough in the way that people are pleasant when they are not particularly interested in the people they are pleasant toward. He was successful, moderately self-satisfied, and the kind of man who listened to you with about 60% of his attention while the other 40% was somewhere else. What I did not know, what I found out much later, was that Theo and Renata had been having serious financial problems that predated the embezzlement. Not poverty-level problems. Problems of the kind that come from living at a scale that slightly exceeds your income, compounded over years, the way credit card balances grow through minimum payments. Their mortgage on the house in Dilworth was substantial. Their cars were leased. Theo had made an investment in a friend's startup in 2015 that had not returned anything. They were not in crisis, but they were in the particular discomfort of people who have expensive tastes and find those tastes slightly more expensive than anticipated. I am not telling you this to excuse what Renata did. I am telling you because Priya was right when she told me that understanding the motive makes the story coherent in a way that raw anger does not. Renata did not steal because she was a sociopath. She stole because she had convinced herself that the company was as much hers as mine, that our father's eventual succession plan would give her ownership anyway, that she was simply taking an advance on what she believed was already owed to her, and that I, with my tighter management style, my ownership of the operational relationships, my presence in every financial decision, was standing between her and what should have been naturally hers. She stole because she resented me. And she justified the resentment to herself because resentment is easier to live with than guilt. That does not make it acceptable. It makes it human, which is worse in some ways and better in others, and I have spent a great deal of time since that boardroom meeting sitting with the difference. In the first week of January of 2018, Douglas Cha delivered his final report. It was 47 pages long, with supporting documentation that ran to over 200 additional pages of transaction records, bank statements, corporate registration documents, and payment histories. The total was $567,400. The 3 shell entities had been traced with high confidence to beneficial ownership that Douglas declined to specify in the report, but described to Priya and me in a private meeting as almost certainly singular, meaning one person. One person who controlled all 3 entities. One person who had been systematically redirecting funds from Voss Contract Group for 3 years, accelerating the pace as the amounts had normalized, using an authorization code meant for emergencies as a routine payment mechanism. Douglas had also identified something I had not anticipated, a pattern of reclassification. Transactions that had originated as disbursements to the shell companies had, in the company's internal books, been reclassified as ordinary operating expenses under categories that I was responsible for overseeing. Marketing expenditures, materials procurement, vendor consulting, categories that, if reviewed by an outside party at a high level, would appear to fall under my operational purview and not Renata's. Someone had been not just stealing the money. Someone had been making the trail point at me. I remember sitting across from Douglas in his office on a Wednesday morning, looking at page 12 of the final report, which was the page that showed the reclassification pattern most clearly. I felt something that took me a moment to identify. It was not anger exactly, it was something colder, the recognition that what I was looking at was not impulsive, it was constructed. Renata had not just been taking money, she had been building a story in which I was the one who had been mismanaging funds, misdirecting expenses, allowing the company's margins to erode. A story that my parents were already halfway to believing because Renata had been tending that narrative carefully for the better part of a year. I thought about the quarterly review in October when she had looked at my father and said I was resistant to new vendor relationships. I thought about the Sunday dinner in December when my mother had said it might be healthier for everyone if some operational oversight moved to Renata's side. I thought about Gerald Fossey drawing something up in the new year. I picked up the report and said, "What do I need to do to make this bulletproof?" Douglas looked at me over the top of his glasses. "It's already bulletproof," he said. "I want you to understand this document with the supporting exhibits establishes the fact of the transactions, the shell company structures, the reclassification pattern, and the timeline with a level of certainty that would satisfy any court in this country. This is not a preliminary opinion. This is a forensic determination." I asked him how he would describe what he found in plain language if he were explaining it to someone who was not a financial professional. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said someone deliberately moved money out of this company through entities they controlled, then altered the records to make it look like it came from a different source and fell under a different person's responsibility. That is embezzlement, and it is also fraud. Both are felonies. I thanked him. I picked up my copy of the report. I drove to Priya's office. We spent 4 hours that afternoon going through options. Priya laid them out methodically. I could go directly to law enforcement, which was my right and which she would fully support. I could pursue civil litigation to recover the funds, which she estimated was highly viable given the documentation. I could present the findings to the board, which consisted of my father, my mother, myself, and Gerald Fossey, and allow the family to decide how to proceed, with the understanding that Priya would be present to ensure that my interests were protected and that any decision about whether to involve law enforcement remained entirely open. I could also do nothing, which Priya mentioned without editorializing because she was thorough. I asked her what she recommended. She leaned back in her chair. I think you already know what you want to do, she said. I think you've known for a while. What you're asking me is whether it's the right call legally, and the answer is yes, any of these options is defensible, but the board meeting gives you something the others don't. I asked her what that was. Your parents in the room, she said, with the evidence in front of them from an independent forensic accountant with no ability to be told a different version of events by someone else first. She was right. That was exactly what I needed. Not a criminal complaint that would reach my parents through a phone call from a detective. Not a civil filing that would show up in a courthouse record before I had spoken to my father. My parents at the table, with Douglas Chaw's report in their hands on a page that I would choose. Page 12. The annual board meeting was scheduled for the third Tuesday of January of 2018. I had 11 days. Priya and I drafted a summary document, 6 pages in plain language, that condensed the key findings of the audit into a narrative that a non-financial reader could follow. We worked with Douglas to prepare a presentation version of the transaction map, the one with the boxes and arrows, that could be printed and included as an exhibit. We prepared copies of the key underlying documents, the Meridian invoices, the Vantage Source payment records, the Breyer consulting transactions, the bank routing analysis, the reclassification ledger, tabbed and organized so that every claim in the report had a supporting document immediately accessible. I also did something that I did not tell Priya about until after it was done. I called my cousin Marco, who was a corporate attorney in New York and who had been the first person in my family to whom I had admitted, the prior spring, that something was wrong at the company. Marco was quiet and precise and had a way of processing difficult information without performing emotion about it, which was exactly what I needed at the time. He had told me back in the spring that if I ever found what I was looking for, I should call him before I did anything. So I called him. I told him what Douglas had found. I told him what I was planning to do at the board meeting. I told him I needed someone in that room who was not my attorney, not my forensic accountant, not my adversary, and not a bystander. Someone who understood what they were looking at and who could speak to my parents directly if necessary. Marco drove down from New York on the Monday before the meeting, and we sat in my dining room until almost midnight going through the report together. At one point, he looked up from page 31 and shook his head slowly. She reclassified these as your expense categories, he said. I said yes. He closed the report. He looked at me across my dining room table with an expression that was something between admiration and concern. How long have you been sitting on this? I told him 14 months. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, okay, I'll be there. The morning of the board meeting, I drove to the office early. The meeting was at 10 in the morning in our main conference room on the 4th floor of the South Tryon building, the room with the long teak table and the windows that looked out over the skyline. I had sat in that room for 6 years. I had presented quarterly reviews there, negotiated contract terms there, delivered news both good and bad across that table. It was as familiar to me as any room I had ever worked in, and I needed it to feel familiar that morning. I arrived at 8:15. The building was quiet. I set up the copies of the report at each seat, mine, my father's, my mother's, Gerald's, and the extra chair I had arranged for Douglas, who would be attending as the report's author. I set Renata's copy at her seat as well, face down. I went to my office. I made coffee. I reviewed my notes one last time, though I had not really needed notes for weeks. I knew the report the way you know something you have read when you could not sleep, in the small hours trying to understand how it got there. At 9:45, Priya arrived and came to my office. She was wearing a dark blazer and carrying her briefcase, and she looked at me and said, "How are you feeling?" I told her I was ready. She said, "Good. Remember, you don't need to say much. The report does the work." At 9:55, Douglas arrived, and I walked him to the conference room and introduced him to Priya, and they shook hands with the ease of professionals who have worked in adjacent orbits long enough to know each other by reputation. At 9:58, my mother arrived. She came in the way she always did, with a warm greeting and an inquiry about whether anyone needed anything, and she looked at the setup, the reports at each seat, the extra chairs, the presence of people she did not recognize, with an expression that I can only describe as the beginning of understanding. not understanding of what specifically was happening, but understanding that this was not the ordinary annual review. She looked at me. She said very quietly, "Adriana, what is this?" I said I would explain when everyone was seated. At 10 o'clock, my father arrived with Gerald Fossey, and they came in together mid-conversation about something I did not follow. My father looked at the room the same way my mother had, and then he looked at me with an expression that was specifically paternal, not alarmed yet, but attentive in a way that meant he had registered the change in atmosphere and was deciding what it meant. He sat down. Gerald sat down, my mother sat down, Douglas sat down. Priya stood near the door, which she had done deliberately because her presence was not as a board participant but as counsel, and she wanted that spatial distinction to be clear. Marco came in at 2 minutes past 10, which is when he had said he would arrive. My father looked at him with recognition and surprise and genuine warmth. He had always liked Marco and said, "Marco, I didn't know you'd be joining us." Marco said he would explain in a moment, and he sat down. We waited. At 7 minutes past 10, Renata came in. She was wearing a cream blouse and dark trousers, and her hair was the way she always wore it to professional meetings, and she had a coffee from the place downstairs, and she was talking on her phone, wrapping up a conversation, and she came through the door still mid-sentence, and then she stopped. She looked at Douglas. She looked at Priya. She looked at Marco. Then she looked at me. I looked back at her, and I did not say anything, and I did not look away. She said into the phone that she would call back. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the seat across from mine at the report sitting face down on the table. Her hand went to her pearl necklace. She had worn it that day, the double strand, the one she always wore to client presentations, and it stayed there. She sat down. I said, "Thank you all for being here. I asked Douglas to attend today because he has completed an independent forensic audit of the company's financial records for the period beginning January of 2015 through December of 2017, and I wanted to share his findings with the full board before we proceed to any other business." My father looked at me. "A forensic audit," he said, "not a question, a repetition." "Yes," I said. He looked at the report in front of him. He did not pick it up yet. Renata's hand was still on her necklace. I said I would ask everyone to turn to page 12. And that is where we are. That is the room I walked you into at the beginning of this story. That is the table and the report and the 11 days of preparation and the 14 months before that. That is my sister's hand on her necklace and my father's careful stillness and my mother's not quite understanding and Gerald Fossey's pen sitting silent on his notepad and Douglas Cha across the table, ready to walk my family through what he had found. Everything that happened next, I am going to tell you in the next part of this story. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, stay. Because what I did when they turned to page 12 is the reason I am telling you the story at all, and it is the reason that, for the first time in 3 years, I slept through the night. My father opened the report. He turned to page 12 slowly, the way you turn pages when you are not sure you want to see what is on the other side. My mother turned to the same page. Gerald Fossey turned to it. Marco already knew what was there. Priya stood near the door with her hands clasped, watching. Renata did not pick up her copy. Douglas cleared his throat. What you're looking at on page 12 is a summary table of 47 transactions identified during the audit period, January 2015 through December 2017, that were dispersed from Voss Contract Group operating accounts to 3 external vendors. Those vendors are identified in the table as Meridian Fulfillment Solutions, Vantage Source Partners, and Breyer Consulting, LLC. My father looked at the table. He looked at the total at the bottom. His reading glasses were on and he leaned forward slightly and I watched him read the number and then I watched him read it again. $567,400. He took his glasses off. He set them on the table. He looked up at Douglas. "What are these companies?" he said. His voice was completely flat. Douglas kept his tone even and precise, the way he always did when he was delivering information he knew was going to hurt someone. "All 3 entities are shell companies, Mr. Voss. Meridian Fulfillment Solutions is registered in Delaware through a registered agent with no verifiable business operations. Vantage Source Partners is registered in Nevada. Breyer Consulting, LLC is registered in Wyoming. None of the 3 has a physical office, a web presence, or any documented business activity beyond the invoices submitted to Voss Contract Group." My mother's hand moved to the table in front of her very slowly and pressed flat against the surface. My father looked at me. "You commissioned this audit?" "Yes," I said. "When I engaged Priya's firm 14 months ago, Douglas began the formal audit process last spring. He absorbed that 14 months. He was doing the math the way I had done it in reverse, counting back, understanding the timeline, understanding that while he had been talking at Sunday dinners about succession plans and operational rebalancing, his elder daughter had been building a forensic case." He looked at Renata. Renata's expression had not broken yet. I want to be clear about that because it is important to the story. She was still composed. Her hand had come down from the necklace. She was sitting with her back straight and her coffee cup in front of her, and she was looking at a point somewhere past my father's shoulder, not at the report, not at me, not at him. It was a very particular kind of stillness, the stillness of someone who has already decided on their posture and is holding it with everything they have. My father said her name. Renata, she looked at him. Do you know what these companies are? Not a question. The same flat tone. Her voice came out measured and careful. Dad, I think before we go any further with whatever this is, we should talk about the context, because I think there are some assumptions being made here that, do you know what these companies are? He said it again, and it was not louder, but something in it had changed. 22 years of Gerald Fossey sitting at that table, and I had never heard my father use that voice. Renata's composure shifted by a fraction, just a fraction. Her eyes moved to the report and then back to my father. I know Meridian. We used Meridian for subcontracted procurement work on several projects. That is a legitimate, Douglas said quietly. The invoices submitted under Meridian's name describe services for which there is no corresponding deliverable in any project file I reviewed. No work product, no meeting records, no communications. The descriptions are generic enough to fit any project but specific enough to reference real project names, which is consistent with how fraudulent invoicing is typically structured. Renata looked at Douglas with an expression I can only describe as the moment someone decides that a calm tone is not going to be sufficient. Her voice stayed even. I don't know who you are or who hired you, but I'm not going to sit here and let someone I've never met tell our family. I hired him, I said, and he is going to finish. Silence, 4 full seconds. My mother looked at me and then at Renata and then back down at page 12, and something in her expression changed. Not understanding yet. Something prior to understanding. The sensation that the ground you thought was stable has shifted under your feet, and you have not yet fallen, but you know that you might. Gerald Fossey, to his credit, picked up his pen and started writing. Douglas continued. He walked the room through the transaction timeline methodically, not dramatically, not with any editorial commentary, just dates and amounts and vendor names and the authorization codes used to process each payment. He noted on page 19 that all 47 transactions had been approved using the Emergency Payment Authorization Code, and that the audit had identified 2 individuals with access to that code, myself as Director of Operations and Renata as Director of Client Relations. He then turned to page 23. Page 23 documents a second pattern identified during the audit, he said. The transactions I described were dispersed from the operating accounts. However, in the company's internal financial records, those disbursements were reclassified after the fact as ordinary operating expenses in categories including materials procurement, vendor consulting, and marketing expenditure. All 3 of those categories fall under the operational budget oversight of the Director of Operations. My father looked up from the page, very slowly. Renata's hand went back to her necklace. My mother said softly, Adriana's budget. Yes, Douglas said. My father looked at me and his expression had something in it that I was not prepared for even after 14 months of preparation. It was not anger yet, it was grief. He looked at me the way a man looks when he is trying to understand something that should not be possible, and the understanding keeps arriving anyway in increments, and there is nothing he can do to slow it down. He said, You were being set up. I said, Yes. Renata's voice came out sharp and fast. That is not what happened. She looked at my father directly. Dad, Adriana has been building a case against me for over a year. She has constructed a narrative using an accountant she hired, using documents she had access to, and she is presenting it to you as if it is objective when it is not. I don't know what her motivations are, but this is not fair to the family. This is not fair to me. Marco spoke from his end of the table for the first time. His voice was quiet and utterly unremarkable, which was somehow more devastating than if he had raised it. Renata, the audit was conducted under forensic standards, and its chain of custody is documented from the point of engagement. The conclusions are Douglas's, not Adriana's. The documents are the company's own financial records. Renata looked at Marco. Something moved across her face, recognition that she had not accounted for him being in the room. My father picked up his report and turned to the back. He found the exhibit section. He looked at the copies of the Meridian invoices, the Vantage source payment authorizations, the routing information for the receiving accounts. He turned pages slowly. He was not crying. I want to say that because people sometimes assume that a man in his position would be crying, and my father was not. He was doing what he had always done, processing methodically, without performance. He had built a company from 2 rooms on a handshake. He knew how to look at numbers and understand what they said. He looked at one page for a long time, then he put the report down. He said, Gerald. Gerald Fossey looked up from his notes. Tell me what I am looking at. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He was a man of careful habits, and he was clearly aware in that moment that whatever he said next was going to be said in a room with an attorney and a forensic accountant and a corporate lawyer from New York, and it was going to be said in front of both of the daughters of the man he had served for over 2 decades. He chose his words accordingly. Martin, he said, the documentation in this report, if it is accurate and if the chain of custody is as represented, which I have no basis to challenge, describes what appears to be a systematic diversion of company funds over a 3-year period, combined with an alteration of internal records in a manner that would attribute responsibility for those funds to Adriana's operational budget. Both of those actions would constitute serious legal violations. My mother pressed her hand harder against the table. Renata said, Gerald, you've known this family for 20 years. You've known me since I was Renata. Gerald's voice was not unkind, but it stopped her. I have to advise your father based on what is in front of me. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. I watched her recalibrate. She turned back to my father. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The measured control was still there, but underneath it, something had loosened. Dad. I can explain the Meridian payments. There were legitimate reasons for those vendor relationships that Adriana was not aware of because I was building out a new procurement model and I was going to present it. 47 transactions, my father said, over 3 years. He was looking at the table on page 12. He was not looking at her. You were going to present it. She opened her mouth, closed it. The reclassification, he said. He looked up then. Why does the reclassification point to your sister? Renata did not answer. My father waited. She said, finally, I don't know anything about any reclassification. Douglas turned to page 31. He laid it on the table in front of my father without being asked. This page documents the specific entries. Each reclassification was made in a secondary access session, meaning not during the original transaction processing, but in a separate login. The audit identified the user credentials associated with those sessions. He paused. They were associated with a login profile created using a name and email address that do not correspond to any current employee, but the system access level assigned to that profile matches the access level of the Director of Client Relations. The room absorbed that. Renata stood up. It was a sudden movement, not violent, just abrupt, the way a person moves when they are trying to physically change the temperature of a room by changing their position in it. She pushed back her chair and she looked at me with an expression that I had never seen on her face in 38 years of knowing her. It was not guilt. It was something past guilt, the particular fury of someone who has been caught not by an adversary but by someone they had dismissed. You have been doing this for a year, she said. Her voice had lost the controlled register entirely. You have been sitting at our family's dinner table and smiling and building a case against your own sister. Do you understand how? Do you have any idea what this is going to do to Mom and Dad? Did you even think about what this would do to this family? I looked at her and I kept my voice completely level. I thought about it every day for 14 months. Then why? Because $567,000, I said. That is why. She stared at me. And because you were going to take the company, I said, not just the money. You had positioned yourself so that Dad was going to restructure operational authority in your direction, which means you were going to take the company I have spent 6 years building while I was standing there having no idea you were simultaneously blaming me for the losses you created. That is why. My father made a sound, not a word, just a sound. He put his hand over his face briefly and then took it away. My mother said, Renata. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Renata, tell me this is not true. Renata looked at our mother. I watched her in that moment make a calculation. I watched her look at my mother's face, at the specific grief on it, the mother grief, the grief of someone who needs something to not be true, and I watched Renata decide whether there was still a version of this that worked. There was not. She sat back down. She looked at the table in front of her. Her shoulders, which had been held very straight all morning, dropped by an inch. Nobody spoke for what felt like a long time. The clock on the wall of the conference room was audible in the silence. I had never noticed it before, but I noticed it then, the mechanical patience of it, marking time while my family did the hardest thing it had ever done together. Gerald broke the silence. Martin, I need to recommend strongly that we engage a corporate attorney separately from family counsel at this point. This has crossed into territory where the company's legal interests and the family's personal interests are going to diverge, and I am not the right person to navigate both. My father nodded without looking up. Priya spoke from the door. There's also a question of next steps with respect to the financial recovery and any potential reporting obligations. I've prepared a brief summary of the options, which I can leave with the board. My father nodded again. Renata looked up. She looked at Priya, at Douglas, at Marco, and then she looked at me. There were no tears. I want to be accurate about that. My sister was not the kind of person who cried in professional settings, and even in this moment, even with everything crumbling around the table, she held that. What I saw instead was something more private, a kind of collapse that happened behind the eyes while the face held its form. What are you going to do? She said to me. Quiet, direct. I said, that depends on Dad. She looked at our father. He did not look at her. He was looking at the table, at the report, at something past both of them. He said, leave, Renata. I need to talk to Adriana and these people without you in the room. She stood up. She picked up her phone, which was on the table in front of her, and she looked at it for a moment as if she was going to say something else, and then she did not. She walked out of the conference room and the door closed behind her, and the sound it made was not loud. What happened in the 3 days after that meeting is the part of the story that belongs to my family in a way that the rest of it does not. I'm going to tell you the substance of it because you have been with me this far and you deserve the truth of it. But I'm going to tell it quickly because the weight of those 3 days is not mine to perform for anyone. My father sat at that table for 2 hours after Renata left. He asked Douglas questions. He asked Priya questions. He asked Gerald to stay. He asked Marco at one point whether, in his professional opinion, the documentation was sufficient to support legal action, and Marco said yes without qualification. My father thanked him. He asked my mother to go home, and she did not want to, and he asked her again gently, and she went. At the end of those 2 hours, my father looked at me and said, "What do you want to happen?" I had thought about that question for 14 months. I had rehearsed the answer in my car on the way to Priya's office and in my apartment at midnight and sitting in my driveway unable to go inside. I had a list of things I wanted: recovery of the stolen funds, protection of my position in the company, correction of the financial record, acknowledgement that what had been done to me was real and deliberate and not a misunderstanding. But sitting across from my father in that conference room, I said what was true. I said I wanted the company to survive. I wanted the record corrected. I wanted what was taken from it returned in whatever form that was possible. And I wanted my father to know from this point forward exactly what had happened. He said he already knew what had happened. I told him I was sorry, not for the audit, not for the process, not for sitting across from him in that room, but for the fact that it was real. For the fact that the thing I had spent 14 months hoping I was wrong about turned out to be something I was exactly right about. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine for a moment. Then he took it away and picked up his glasses and put them back on. Now I need to tell you about the 2 weeks that came before that board meeting because the story does not work without them. The board meeting was on the third Tuesday of January. But 10 days before that, something happened that I have not told you about yet, and it is the thing that, in the particular language of chess, we would call the false gambit. On the Saturday before the board meeting, Renata called me. It was late in the afternoon, and I was in my apartment going over the exhibit tabs for the audit copies when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. I needed those 2 seconds to become someone who did not know what she did not know. When I answered, I kept my voice the way you keep a house when you know company is coming, everything in its place, nothing out of the ordinary. She said she wanted to get coffee, just us. We met the following morning at a cafe near our office that we had gone to together dozens of times, and she was already there when I arrived at a table in the back corner, and she had ordered my drink, which was the kind of detail she always remembered. That attention to the small things, that was the genuine Renata, and it made what came next both easier and harder. She waited until I was settled. Then she said she needed to talk to me about the company. I asked her what about. She said she had been doing some thinking about the direction things were going and about our relationship, and she thought it might be time, before Dad's succession planning got any further along, for the two of them to have a real conversation about how the structure was working. I said I thought that sounded like a good idea. She set her cup down and looked at me directly. "Adriana, I'm going to be honest with you. The way things are structured right now, with you running operations and me running client relationships, it's not working. The margins have been compressing. We've had friction with vendors. There have been questions at the last 2 quarterly reviews about expense allocation that Dad is starting to notice." I noted the phrasing: expense allocation, vendor friction, compressing margins. The narrative she had been tending, fully bloomed, now being delivered to my face. I let my expression do something soft. I said, "I know, I've been worried about that too." Something shifted in her posture, a small adjustment of confidence, the recognition that I was not going to fight her. "I think if you were willing to move to a more advisory role," she said, "and let me take over operational oversight with you staying on the board, obviously, fully, I think it would actually be better for you, less pressure, and it would let me build out the kind of structure I've been thinking about." The kind of structure I've been thinking about. Meaning the kind of structure in which she had full access to every financial system in the company with no one looking over her shoulder. I let my lip do what it did. Not a tremble exactly, more of a compression, the kind your mouth makes when you are trying to hold something together. I had practiced this, and I am not ashamed to say that. I had sat in front of my bathroom mirror and practiced the expression of someone who is reluctantly considering something they do not want to accept, because I needed Renata to see something specific. I said, "You think Dad would go for something like that?" She said she thought he would, especially if I was the one to propose it. She said it would look better coming from me, more gracious, less like a conflict, more gracious. I let that land. I looked at my coffee cup and I was quiet for a moment, and I let the silence be the silence of someone who is weighing something difficult, not the silence of someone who has 47 documented transactions and a forensic accountant on retainer. Then I said, "What would that look like practically?" She had a document. Of course she did. She pulled it out of her bag, 4 pages, printed, titled Proposed Operational Governance Framework, Voss Contract Group, January 2018. She slid it across the table to me. I read it. I read it very carefully while projecting the body language of someone reading it for the first time with mild anxiety. The document proposed that Renata assume the title of Chief Operating Officer with authority over all financial approvals above $25,000, all vendor relationships, and all project management oversight. My role would become Senior Strategic Advisor, with board membership retained but without operational signature authority. It was a beautifully constructed document. It was also page by page the architecture of exactly what she had been building the Meridian and Vantage source invoices to enable. I turned to the last page. There was a signature block for each board member and a date line. I looked up at her. I let my expression be the expression of someone who is tired, who has been running the company for 6 years and is perhaps ready to let some of that weight shift to someone else, who is choosing her relationship with her sister over the instinct that tells her something is wrong. If Dad agrees, I said slowly, I could consider this. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. I just think it would be better for both of us, she said, for the family. I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about my father's hand on mine in the conference room 10 days later and how different the same gesture felt. I said, give me a few days to think about it. She said, of course. She was warm about it, generous in her warmth. She picked up her coffee and asked about my weekend, and I told her about nothing in particular, and she told me about Eli, who had lost a tooth, and we sat in that coffee shop for another 20 minutes talking like sisters, and when we said goodbye she hugged me and I hugged her back and she said she was glad we had talked. I drove directly from that cafe to Priya's office. I put the governance framework document on her desk. Priya read it. She read it without commenting. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, she actually printed this. I said yes. She printed it with a signature block. I said yes. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, this document attempts to transfer operational authority using a format that could, in some circumstances, be mistaken for a formal board action. It lists all 4 board members in the signature block. If this had been signed by you, she stopped. She was going to present this as a formal governance change. I said I thought so too. Priya said, I want you to send me a copy of this. This is going in the exhibit file. She added it to the exhibit file, and it became page 41 of the audit report's supporting documentation, the proposed operational governance framework, dated January 8, 2018, 3 days before I had my final meeting with Douglas and 13 days before the board meeting. A document that Renata had prepared and had asked me to consider signing, which would have handed her operational authority over every financial system in the company. A document that I had never signed. I want you to understand what I did not do in that coffee shop. I did not tell Renata what was coming. I did not give her any indication that the board meeting she was going to attend the following Tuesday was going to be different from every other board meeting she had attended. I did not warn her, I did not confront her, I did not give her time to construct a defense or flee or transfer assets or call her own attorney. I went home and I made dinner and I called Marco and told him about the governance document and he said quietly, Adriana, you are going to end her. I said, I am going to end what she did. He said, I know, I'm still going to be there Tuesday. I slept better that night than I had in 14 months. Not because I felt good about what was coming, but because I had done what I needed to do in the right order, the right way, and there was nothing left to hold. He thought I was broken. My mother thought I was stressed. My father thought I was preparing quarterly metrics. My sister thought she had found the gracious version of her own victory. The papers were never going to be signed. The trap was already set. I had exactly 3 days. The board meeting ended, and what followed was not a single dramatic scene. It was a series of rooms, some quiet and some not, in which the truth that I had been carrying for over a year was redistributed to everyone who had the right to hold it. My father called Renata that afternoon. I do not know exactly what was said. I know that it was long over an hour from what my mother told me later, and I know that at some point during that call, my mother went to sit in the kitchen because she could hear her husband's voice from behind the closed door of his study, and she did not want to hear what it sounded like when he finally understood everything. Priya filed a formal complaint with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office on the Thursday following the board meeting. She presented Douglas's report and the full exhibit file, and she was thorough about it because Priya is always thorough. The matter was assigned to a detective in the Financial Crimes Unit, a woman named Detective Acaffer, who called me that Friday and asked if I could come in the following week and walk her through the audit. I walked her through the audit. On the 29th of January, 2018, Renata was formally notified by the district attorney's office that she was under investigation for embezzlement and fraud. She retained a criminal defense attorney, not Gerald Fossey, who had immediately and appropriately recused himself from any matter involving her personally, but a firm from uptown that specialized in white-collar defense. Theo, for what it is worth, called me 3 weeks after the board meeting. I did not answer. He texted the following day and said he was sorry and that he had not known. I did not respond to that either, not because I disbelieved him, but because I did not have a response that was both true and useful, and I had spent enough of my life managing other people's discomfort about things Renata had done. My mother called me every day for the first 2 weeks after the board meeting. Sometimes she called to talk, and sometimes she called to cry, and sometimes she called to tell me haltingly that she understood why I had done it the way I had done it, and that she was sorry it had been necessary, and that she loved me. I told her I loved her too, which was true, and that I did not blame her for not seeing it, which was also true, and which took me longer to arrive at than I am probably making it sound. My father restructured his role at the company. He came back to the office in February in a more active capacity than he had maintained in years, not because he did not trust me, but because he needed something to do with his hands, and the company was something that he had built and that he could still touch. We worked together that spring in a way that we had not since I had first joined the firm, and there were mornings when I would look up from the conference room table and see him looking at the spreadsheet in front of him with the same focused calm he had always had, and I would think that some things, at least, were still what they were. The civil action to recover the embezzled funds was filed in the spring of 2018. Priya pursued it with the particular precision of someone who has all of the documentation and knows she has all of the documentation. Renata's defense was that the transactions had been for legitimate business purposes, that the documentation was insufficient, and that the forensic audit had been conducted under a bias created by my involvement in commissioning it. Douglas spent 2 days in a deposition defending his methodology and his conclusions, and when the deposition was over, the opposing counsel had not materially shaken a single finding. The civil settlement was reached in the fall of 2018. Renata agreed to repay $480,000 to Voss Contract Group, structured over 4 years with interest, drawn in part from the equity in her house in Dilworth, which she and Theo sold the following spring. The full $567,000 was not recovered. It rarely is in cases like this, where some funds have already been spent, but $480,000 was recovered, plus interest, plus legal costs, and the company survived intact. The criminal matter was slower. These things usually are. The district attorney's office pursued embezzlement charges and financial fraud charges. Renata's attorney negotiated for over a year. In February of 2020, Renata pleaded guilty to 1 count of embezzlement and 1 count of financial fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, ordered to complete community service, and required to pay restitution under the terms already established in the civil settlement. She did not go to prison. I am not going to pretend that the outcome on that point satisfied everyone. It did not entirely satisfy me, but I had been advised from the beginning that white-collar embezzlement cases rarely result in custodial sentences for first-time offenders who cooperate and settle civil liability, and Priya had prepared me for that reality honestly. Renata's employment with Voss Contract Group was terminated by the board in January of 2018, effective immediately following the board meeting. She has not worked in the commercial interior design industry since. She and Theo separated in 2019, and their divorce was finalized the following year. I do not know the details of that, and I do not need to. Gerald Fossey retired from the family retainer that spring, not under any pressure from us, but of his own determination, I think, that the situation had introduced a complexity he was not equipped to carry. My father thanked him warmly and meant it. My father sold his majority stake in Voss Contract Group to me in 2020 at a valuation that reflected the company's actual financial health, which was, by that point, substantially stronger than it had been during the years of the embezzlement, partly because we were no longer losing over $150,000 a year to shell companies, and partly because I had spent 2 years rebuilding the vendor relationships and operational infrastructure with full visibility into every transaction. He retained a minority stake and a board seat, which he still holds. We have lunch every other week at a restaurant near the office, and we talk about the company and about other things, and the relationship between us is, I think, the most honest it has ever been, which is one of the few gifts that came from all of it. I moved out of my apartment in the spring of 2019 and bought a house in Plaza Midwood, 3 miles from the office, with a backyard that I have been slowly transforming into something my mother would recognize as a garden. I am not a natural gardener. But there is something about the patience it requires, the specific discipline of planting something and waiting for it and not forcing it, and trusting that if you have prepared the ground correctly, it will come, that I have found more instructive than I expected. Eli, Renata's son, my nephew, turned 9 the summer after the board meeting. He does not fully understand what happened. He is old enough to know that his mother and I do not speak, and young enough that he takes the fact of it as simply one of the fixed conditions of his world. I sent him a birthday card and a book he had mentioned wanting. I will continue to do that. He did not choose any of this. My name is Adriana Voss. I am the daughter of a man who built something real out of 2 rooms and faith, and I spent 6 years protecting it before I understood that the threat was not external. I am the woman who sat in a parking structure in the rain and called her attorney instead of her sister. I am the woman who smiled across a conference table for 14 months while building a case that left no room for interpretation. I am not proud of all of it. I am not proud of the nights I drove home in silence rehearsing conversations that had not happened yet, or of the Sunday dinners where I sat with my family and let normalcy be a costume I wore because I had not yet built the stage I needed. I am not proud of the way it felt to watch my father read that audit report, page by careful page, learning something I had known for over a year, but I am proud of the audit. I am proud of the fact that when the moment came, the evidence was real, the conclusions were documented, and the truth was not something anyone in that room could argue with. I am proud that I did not act out of anger or impulse or the desperate need to be believed. I waited until I did not need to be believed because I had proof. Renata asked me in that conference room whether I had thought about what this would do to the family. I want to answer that question honestly because I think she deserved an honest answer and I did not give her one at the time. Yes, I thought about it every day. I thought about my parents' faces, about the Sunday dinners, about Eli and his missing tooth and the books he liked to read and the way he called me Aunt Audrey. I thought about all of it, and I built the case anyway because the alternative was to let a lie stand in the place where truth belonged, and I could not do that, not for the money, not even for the company, but because I had been standing next to that lie for 3 years and I was tired of the weight of it. The lie was that I was the problem. That my management was the issue, that the right answer was to give more authority to the person who was stealing from us while pinning the evidence on me. I was not the problem. If you have ever been handed a narrative about yourself that you knew was wrong, and you watched the people who loved you start to believe it, and you had to decide whether to fight it immediately and risk being dismissed, or to wait and build something that could not be dismissed, then you already understand what the last 14 months of that story felt like. You understand why the waiting is not weakness. You understand why the evidence mattered more than the argument. Your audit is waiting. Whatever form it takes for you, the documentation, the truth, the proof that what happened to you was real, it is worth building. Build it carefully, build it completely. And when the room is ready, turn to page 12. Hit that like button if this story stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And comment below, I want to know, would you have waited or would you have said something the moment you knew? Tell me, I'm reading every single one.